What's the emergency?
No problem. All units are
Hi,
by
I'm at the corner of Pleasant Hill and John Young Freeway.
1519 East 18.
Welcome back, everyone, to Crime Solvers Central. I'm Charlie.
And I'm Jayce. Today, we're diving into one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries out of Oklahoma, the Jamison family murders.
We've got a very special guest with us today, someone who's covered this case extensively on his channel, Adrian from Coffeehouse Crime. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Charlie. Hey, Jayce. Thank you so much for having me today. And yeah, it's always a pleasure to talk true crime with you. And wow, the Jamison case, this one will stick with you for sure.
So let's start with the basics. The Jamison family, Bobby, his wife Sherilynn, and their 6-year-old daughter Madyson, all vanished on October 8th, 2009, near Red Oak, Oklahoma.
Exactly. They were looking at some land in the Sans Bois Mountains, about 30 miles from their home in Eufaula, and then poof, gone.
Then a few days later, their pickup truck was found abandoned, and inside were their wallets, IDs, cell phones, GPS, and about $32,000 in cash. And even their poor dog Maisie, malnourished but alive.
And that discovery is one of the most chilling parts for me, I think. Families don't just walk away from money, IDs, their phones, and especially not from their pet. I think that part really stuck with me. It immediately raised red flags, and it just deepened the mystery behind their sudden disappearances, really.
And then 4 years later, in 2013, hunters stumbled upon skeletal remains less than 3 miles from that truck.
And those remains were confirmed 1 year later as belonging to the Jamisons. But here's the kicker. The cause of death was undetermined.
That's right, and their decomposition was so advanced that the authorities couldn't say whether it was homicide or exposure or something else entirely. I think that's one of the main reasons why this case is still wide open. Nobody knows what precisely happened to the Jamison family.
We've also got that eerie home surveillance footage, the Jamisons pacing back and forth to their truck, loading items, but doing so in a strange, trance-like way.
And don't forget, something important, Sherilynn's handgun and a brown briefcase that was seen in that footage have never been recovered.
Of them in the surveillance footage is just highly up for debate, right? As for the briefcase, that's one of the most debated pieces of evidence to this case. Some see it as signs of drug use, others think it was maybe stress or paranoia, or maybe even something far darker. But I can't wait to get to the bottom of this with you guys today.
Absolutely, I agree. And after watching your video, I think I have another theory too. So we'll hold to get to that. But today we are going to walk through the big theories, from family disputes to drug connections to cults and paranormal claims.
And then we'll hit Adrian with some of your burning questions and maybe come out the other side with some fresh insights.
Let's start by unpacking the timeline in more detail.
Their disappearance was initially not noted. Only after a couple days did friends and family start to worry about them. And of course, 8 days later, on October the 16th, the family truck was found around about 30 miles northeast of where they lived in Eufaula, on the plot of land they were interested in buying on the mountains. This truck was found by the local Latimer County sheriff. And this is where things start to get a little strange.
So let's rewind to October 8th, 2009, the last day the Jamison family was seen alive.
That morning, the three of them left their home in Eufaula and headed into the Sans Bois Mountains. They were supposedly interested in a 40-acre plot of land, maybe to build a new life away from town.
Yes, and their plan at the time was quite unusual and unorthodox. I'm not sure about you, Jayce and Charlie, but I know in recent years this big tiny home movement has become a big thing in the States. People are looking to buy shipping containers and live off the grid on their own land, kind of away from society. But back then it was
a little bit more unusual. They had a storage container that they wanted to live on, this very remote piece of property. It does give you a sense of the family's mindset at the time. They were looking for isolation, perhaps a simpler life. Maybe they were trying to run away from their previous lives. There was also a lot of tension and odd behavior surrounding them at the time. So that last potential theory that they were trying to run away from something is very valid.
By October 16th, just over a week later, a hunter finds their truck locked up in a remote dirt road. Inside, investigators find those personal items that we discussed earlier: wallets, phones, IDs, GPS, and that mysterious $32,000 in cash.
And crucially, their little dog Maisie, barely hanging on in the back seat. This detail makes this case so much more haunting. If this family left voluntarily, why leave your dog behind?
And to me, that's one of the biggest mysteries, Charlie. I think leaving your dog behind is just absolutely unheard of, especially in a situation where you know you would not be coming back. Even more crucially, the money. I think there are two mysteries behind that. People don't just abandon $32,000 in cash. Not only that, but no family or friends know where the Jamison family received that cash. We'll talk more about it in a while, but they were unemployed. There were no real means of them acquiring that money through legitimate means. Or if they did, they were very quiet about it. So not even investigators could figure out where that came from.
And after their disappearance, a massive search kicks off. Hundreds of volunteers and law enforcement combing the area. But it goes cold fast.
Then 4 years later, on November 16th, 2013, two hunters stumble on the skeletal remains of two adults and one child, less than 3 miles from where the truck was found.
And what's especially frustrating here is that the remains were found in an area that had already been searched before multiple years prior. That's one of the details that really gnaws away at the investigators, but is also something that I've heard is being debated about a lot between communities and people searching. How could they have been missed?
Yeah, and we did discuss that earlier, but I think it's interesting to imagine that they might have been placed there after the fact, but with no clear cause of death. The theories just started piling up. And let's just say some of them are pretty wild.
Yes, we're talking about everything from family feuds to drug deals to cults to the supernatural. This case really has it all.
And that's the thing, right? Every theory has some sort of supporting evidence, whether it's circumstantial or a little more definite. None of these theories seem to fit perfectly. And that's why this case is still unsolved. Every answer seems to create another question or two. This is one giant rabbit hole that we're about to go down.
So let's break those theories down before we dive into the Q&A.
All right, so first up is Bobby's father. Bobby filed a protective order against his dad, claiming threats, even being hit by his father's car in 2008. Bobby was suing him for money, but he said that he was owed from a gas station business.
Precisely. Bobby and Bob Dean's relationship was very turbulent, to say the least. He described his father as dangerous and involved with drugs and meth and criminal activity, so there was a lot of contention between the two. Bobby was definitely scared of his father. But here's the catch. Bob Dean died in 2009, and 2 months before the family disappeared. Even before that period of time, he was in hospital. He was quite sick. It is very unlikely that he was actually involved in their disappearance or their deaths. Some do believe that maybe he could have orchestrated something before he was sick, before he passed away. Officially, he was never really considered a suspect by law enforcement. It's also quite a stretch. How far would he go on his deathbed to ask for a hit on his own son? I don't think that's the headspace he would have been in at the time. You know, he's probably looking to make peace with his life. He's not thinking about revenge on his very own son. But there was definite contention between the two. And you're right, they shared a business together. They were working for each other. And that working relationship broke down quite aggressively towards the end. So it's not outside the realm of possibility, but it's definitely a theory.
Yeah. I think for me, out of all of the theories, this one's the most least likely. Whenever anything happens in somebody's life around me and they're getting really frustrated, I always ask, like, when you're on your deathbed, like, ask yourself, when you're on your deathbed, how much is this really going to matter? That's always my go-to, and that's exactly how I feel about all of this, especially with your own child. He's on his deathbed. I just don't buy that the father had anything to do with it.
I agree completely, yeah. Especially
Yeah.
considering it
So
happened after his passing.
Yeah.
It would have
Yeah,
had
that
to
they found
require
that.
a lot of foresight, a lot of foresight, if that were the
Yes,
case.
exactly.
precisely. And it is worth highlighting that his mother and other people in the community none of them believed that Bob Dean could potentially be responsible for this. There, of course, are issues with his character and the decisions he had made in the past, but nobody believed that he was capable of revenge on his son by murdering the entire family, especially when his
Mhm.
priorities had shifted so much in the later part of his life when he was on his deathbed.
The second big theory has to do with drugs. The quote-unquote trance-like surveillance footage, the unexplained $32,000 in cash, and the odd behavior from all of the family members. It really made investigators wonder if the Jamisons were involved in dealing or using drugs, meths, or any other type of hard drugs.
That's right. And I think we'll be talking about the surveillance footage multiple times throughout this episode. Family and friends swore that they were not dealers. One thing to mention about this briefcase is that the money that they found in there was a complete surprise to law enforcement and a surprise to friends, family. The Jamisons didn't have much cash. They were known to be quite tight financially. Nobody knows where this money came from. It certainly didn't come through employment. Both of them were unemployed at the time. And that does lead to questions like, okay, so they didn't acquire this cash legitimately. How else could they have potentially got a hold of it? And I think one of the first things you think about, especially historically they were taking drugs, is that maybe potentially they were, in fact, drug dealers. But here's the thing. If they were out there to sell drugs, why bring your 6-year-old daughter? I think that's the real sticking point to this theory. Some people would argue that maybe
Yeah.
this was to try and diffuse the situation. Are you really going to bring a gun to a meeting or a rendezvous where you've got a 6-year-old child? So some people thought that maybe this could be like a defense tactic. This would keep the situation calm. This means that the situation wouldn't spiral or escalate. I'm not sure about that one. I'm curious to hear
Mhm.
what you think, Charlie and Jayce.
So a couple of things that are worth noting is that, at least in my experience, when people go up into the woods, it's not uncommon for them to take some form of weapon with them because you could encounter, scary people. But more likely, you could encounter a bear, a cougar, a mountain lion, or things like that. And so, for me to hear that they, took a weapon into the woods, that doesn't shock me at all. The drug theory, though, the thing that gets me was that I saw in like videos that I watched that there was no evidence. And I would think that typically if somebody is involved in drugs, either using them and or distributing them, there's some type of drug, either paraphernalia around if you're the user, or there's some type of trace evidence that those drugs were in your possession, in your home, in your vehicle. And from everything that I've seen so far, there is absolutely no evidence of drugs. I think the money part is where I think people get hung up to and maybe thinking it was drugs. My mind went to how long had they been on disability? How recently did they both get on disability? Because I know when you apply for disability, it could take years to get it, but they back pay you from the date you applied. So if it took 2 years for them to approve your disability, then they send you this big check for 2 years of back pay. In my mind, they could have saved the back money from when they got approved for their disability just for something like this. One day we want to move. One day we want to do these things. And so maybe they just didn't tell anybody that they had got that money, or if they had so many lawsuits in play, did any of them get settled out and nobody knew about it? Did anybody go through court records to see if any of those lawsuits ever, maybe came to a settlement and then they got the money that way? I don't know. I had a few questions cross my mind over this part.
Yeah, and one other point I wanted to raise there, Charlie, is you're right. A lot of people get stuck on this briefcase with $32,000 found inside. And they immediately go to, okay, why did they have the money there? This must be related to drugs. But again, I want to highlight that the vehicle was found on the plot of land that they were looking to buy from the owner. So there is a legitimate reason why they would have this cash in the truck for completely peaceful and legal means. They were probably looking to buy that plot of land. And where the truck was found was further up the hill. So you take a right turn into this vast plot of land. You drive up the driveway and you've got the host or the owner's cabin on the right. And then you drive further up the hill, and that's where the truck was found, towards a dead end. So they must have had permission to go past this owner's home, got out the vehicle for whatever reason, or were forced out the vehicle, and then disappeared, because that's where the truck, the dog, the money, everything was found. Again, this theory leads into them just simply wanting to buy the property. But it does ask other questions. How did the owner know, or did the owner know, that their truck suddenly stopped and then they got out, they disappeared on his land? Because I think the owner only found this truck a couple days later after they disappeared, right? So again, this leads to more questions. As soon as we get to one answer about a theory, there are more questions which seem to muddy the waters even further.
Yeah, and I think that there are some arguments out there that maybe 32,000 wasn't enough to buy the plot of land itself. We don't know exactly how much they were buying it for. Even if it wasn't enough, it's possible they were doing it for appliances, for anything that they were going to build on that plot of land. But building off of that, do you think that the landowner had anything to do with it? Was he cleared by investigators?
So, Jayce, that's a really good question. The truth is that I initially thought that the landowner may have had some sort of involvement in their disappearances or deaths. But one thing to remember here is that the main motive, if he were to be involved, would have been the cash that they had in the vehicle, and that was found long after they disappeared. So there was no real motive for him to murder the family. It is also worth noting that police cleared him very early on in the investigation. Not only did he have a rock-solid alibi, but he actually had a GPS tracker on his vehicle, and that vehicle cleared him from being around the family at the time that they disappeared and they were murdered. So I find that to be a very interesting aspect to the case. I remember when I initially looked into this, I thought that perhaps the landowner had something to do with this. But yeah, the more that you look into it, rock-solid alibi, no motive other than cash, which was still found in the truck. It really doesn't seem like he was involved in this.
Yeah. For me, there's a lot of suspicion around the landowner as well. I personally feel like they stopped at the house and the landowner knew they were there. But we'll keep it moving along. I want to get through all the theories, and then maybe we could circle back to what we all really think. So another theory or point is cult involvement. The Jamisons had rented a room to a man with alleged ties to a white supremacist group. And later, Sherilynn's mom claimed that her daughter's name ended up on a cult hit list.
Right. And friends reported that Sherilynn was, in fact, dabbling in seances too, while Bobby was talking about spirits and even asked the pastor about special bullets to deal with them. Also, read somewhere that he admitted to the pastor that at the time he was reading the Satanic Bible. I think we're dealing with two very different elements here. We're talking about three elements, in fact. We're talking about cults. We're talking about a white supremacist group. We're talking about more paranormal aspects too. It all paints a picture of a family under various strange pressures. Let's begin with the cults. What we do know is that Sherilynn's mother did in fact believe that her daughter, perhaps even the entire family, were on a cult hit list. I don't know too much about cults myself, but I do know that these things exist. Of course, they had a roommate who was formerly, or maybe even perhaps currently, who we don't know, a white supremacist and was part of a white supremacist group. At one point, he was trying to recruit the family into this group. And as you both know, there was a lot of contention between Sherilynn and him at that point. In fact, that broke down the entire relationship and friendship between the two. And he was asked to leave the house immediately. Again, yet another feud between the family and external factors or the community. Yeah, who knows? Who knows what really happened there? What precisely was going on there? What are your thoughts, Jayce and Charlie?
I don't think that that is how they ended up murdered. I do think has a lot to do probably with why they left. I do absolutely 100% feel like they felt the house was haunted. You know, they truly believed that. They felt that. They were terrified to the point of asking for special bullets to kill the bad spirits. If there was any witchcraft or cult involvement, that's just all very dark and very scary. I think that that probably has a lot to do with why they left, but I don't think it has anything to do with what happened that day on that property.
And I do think that extremist groups and cults, even though they're different, there is sometimes a lot of overlap. So I think that all of it mounting up together made them more paranoid than they already were, which they already were extremely superstitious about where they were living and everything that was going on around them. So I think that's definitely a big reason for why they left. But I agree. I don't think that it had anything to do with their deaths. And there is also speculation about a possible murder or even an accidental death in the woods. If we recall, Sherilynn had struggled with her mental health, and the family dynamic was said to be strained. Do you think that had anything to do with their disappearance?
I definitely think it's a potential contributing factor. We have to remember here that Sherilynn suffered from bipolar disorder, and that's an extremely disruptive mental health condition to have, not just for yourself, but for those around you. Not only would it have affected her behavior, but also potentially affected the behavior and life around her, including Bobby and the rest of the family. But the interesting thing here is that no weapon was ever recovered from the crime scene or the area in which that they were found. And the remains didn't give the investigators any clear signs of trauma either. While we can't rule out homicide, we also can't rule out that maybe they had died through natural means, exposure to the elements, for example, which I know that we'll talk about in a while. But it is very hard to settle on the idea that, perhaps Sherilynn's mental health caused her to have some sort of bipolar episode and then go on to murder her entire family and herself. There's no evidence to suggest this. And again, I'm chomping at the bit here. I'd love to talk more about this. We will in a while. But just to put it out there was no gun found at the crime scene, no murder weapon, just their remains.
Adrian, what I saw in the videos that I was watching while researching this was that there was a small hole in the back of the father's head. What do you make of that? There was some suggestion that that could possibly be from like a bullet hole, with no gun found. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so from what I researched and found online while looking at this case is that when the bodies were found, they did note that there was a small hole in the back of of Bobby's head. They couldn't determine if perhaps it was, perhaps maybe the entrance to where a bullet projectile had entered his head, or if perhaps this was just, general degradation of the skull over time. Maybe a wild animal had got to his body. Maybe it could have been a fall. We don't quite know, but it does leave an open possibility that maybe he was shot in the back of the head. And one other thing that I'll say is that all three bodies were found lined up, almost like it was some sort of execution, with all three of them in a line. It does also lend to that potential theory too. But the truth is, we don't actually know if this was, if, for example, Bobby was shot in the head, or if this was just general degradation and damage to his skull over time.
Okay. Yeah, because I was just thinking if we know that they took a gun with them, and one of the theories might have been like a murder. Is there a way to take a bullet from that same type of a gun and see if it matches to possibly rule out that theory even, I don't know, my police officer thoughts just kind of going down a rabbit hole. So we've got family conflict, we've got drugs, cults, and accidents as major theories. Each one has its holes, and each one has some possibilities.
Yeah, and that then brings us to the fun part, which are the questions. So, Adrian, we've pulled together some of the most pressing questions that people have about this case, and we're going to throw them at you.
All right, that sounds great. Let's do it.
Jamison's had a home surveillance system, and the day before they left on their journey, this camera recorded footage of them loading up the truck. There's not a lot to say about it, really. It's a little odd that Bobby and Sherilynn loaded the truck up 20-25 times. Seems excessive. Israel stated in an interview that Bobby and Sherilynn looked trance-like while loading up the truck. Almost everyone who's reviewed this case has used the same words, trance-like. But personally speaking, they look normal to me. I don't think it's odd to not talk while you're loading up a van or a truck. You just want to get the job done.
So let's start with that mysterious envelope of cash, the 32 grand left in the truck. Where do you think that came from?
Well, I think that's the $1 million question, right? Or rather, the $32,000 question. Some speculate that perhaps it was from a lawsuit settlement or savings. Charlie, you caught that potential theory earlier on, but there is no paper trail to suggest that. And I do think that if this was a potential theory, then law enforcement would have probably highlighted that release statement, the public statements they'd released prior. Others think that potentially it was related to drugs. That certainly is a possibility. How do you suddenly show up with $32,000 in cash? Friends, family, everyone was stunned that the Jamisons had this and that they had access to this level of cash. And it's not like that they had never touched drugs either. They had routinely entertained themselves in that industry already. So there is a strong possibility that they had the right connections, they had also become drug dealers themselves. It also suggests a possible motive. Maybe they were tapping into an industry already was covered in the area, and they'd made enemies with other dealers that had established themselves long before. Yeah, that's one potential theory. Others believe that maybe they acquired the cash from disability checks or a loan. And there's also the possibility that maybe over the years that they were employed, they'd simply saved cash and put that under their mattress and told nobody about it. Of course, if you're trying to be shady on the side, maybe not pay the tax dollars that you owe the government, instead you're just slipping cash under the mattress, keeping it hush. You've got more money to play with. That, of course, is what a lot of people do. I don't recommend that. But of course, if they were doing that, they wouldn't be telling family and friends that they had this surplus of cash in the house. It'd be counterintuitive to anybody that may want to try and rob them and steal from them. Yeah, again, that's another potential theory. But the fact that they just left it behind suggests that they either were not thinking clearly, or they felt confident that they could leave that much money in the truck without it being found while they're away, or that they were interrupted suddenly. And I think that is the branch that I'm going down. I believe that something all of a sudden happened to them, because we also have to think about the dog here. They wouldn't leave a briefcase full of cash and their dog in a truck if they were planning on, on returning relatively quickly. So yeah, a lot going on here, but yeah, I don't know where the money came from. I think it would be bad for me to speculate. All I can really do is suggest all the possible avenues, and there are many of them. But would love to know what your thoughts are, Jayce and Charlie.
I have a quick question. Was the money in an envelope in the briefcase, or was the money in an envelope in the truck and the briefcase was gone?
As far as I'm aware, the briefcase was never found, so the money was in an envelope.
Okay. What was in the briefcase is my question.
That's also a very good question.
Right? I feel like possibly whatever was in the briefcase, whether it be drugs or money, was so valuable. Whoever did this just wanted to take it, get the heck out of there, and probably didn't even think that there was something else in the truck of value.
Yeah, I did go a little bit into it, but I think that it had more to do with buying the plot of land than anything to do with, like drugs or any other possibility. I think that's the most likely avenue that they were going down, either for utilities or actually buying the storage container on the plot of land. If it was just the storage container and not the whole entire plot of land, it was 40 acres, of course, so it's a lot of land to work with. But is $32,000 enough to cover everything that they wanted? We're not really sure, but I think that's
I don't think
mostly
it's
where it was
likely.
going to go to.
Yeah, and just to add to what you said there, Jayce, it's worth mentioning that the property was listed at $3,000 per acre. And with the size of land that they would have purchased here, that meant that the owner really was looking for around $115,000. Of course, the Jamisons had basically a quarter of that on them. Yeah, very interesting that they came with such a short amount if it were to be sold for the property, but potentially this might have been a deposit. They may have been thinking, okay, we've got enough to give 25% as a deposit now, and we'll pay for the rest later before we acquire the land. Who knows? Also, it's worth noting that although we keep referring to a briefcase full of cash, what was actually found is like a bank-style bag, kind of in the shape of a briefcase. And this money was found underneath the driver's seat, so it was concealed in the truck. It's not like it was very obviously on display. First of all, they may have had a little bit of confidence knowing that, and that's why they felt comfortable to step away from the truck for a longer period of time. Although no fingerprints were found on the truck, it is also possible that if they were rudely interrupted by somebody and the motive was thievery, taking money, they may have looked inside the truck, realized nothing was there because the bag was well hidden, and then walked away. So just putting that out there.
As I say, it just seems so odd to me that they would get out of the car or out of the truck and leave the dog in. Most people, I think, if they're getting out, especially in the middle of nowhere, your dog's going to come with you, even if it's just to let the dog go potty real quick. If you've been on a really long drive, you're going to let that dog out to go potty. It just seems so odd to me that they would get out but leave the dog in the truck.
And not only did they leave the dog, but where their bodies were found was deep in the red oak forest. Like it was quite far away from their vehicle, all things considered.
So the surveillance footage of Bobby and Sherilynn pacing back and forth to their truck is described as being trance-like. What are your thoughts on that? What's your take on that?
I think this is one of the most interesting aspects of the case, and it's certainly one that I love to talk about. The video is very eerie no matter which way you look at it. Some people see their behavior as perhaps they were on drugs at the time. Some also think that it shows two people under extreme stress or mental health struggles. Quite understandably, a lot of people see their behavior as methodical and almost even robotic. Yeah, to me, I'm really not sure. What I think is that whenever you look at surveillance footage with the bias that it's one of the last times the family were seen alive, you're always going to feel like there is a level of eeriness, a little bit of weird tension. There's something going on in that footage. I think that's the bias that we immediately have, especially when watching videos that are related to true crime, and the general surveillance footage that we see online. Now, it's very hard to tell. This video was shot in 2009. That's a very long time ago. Technology has come a long way since then, especially when it comes down to, for example, the resolution of your video files. You can't really make anything out on this surveillance footage. You can see them walking back and forth. And I think we immediately go to, okay, this is a very repetitive type of behavior. This is a little bit strange. This is trance-like. But were they really? We can't make out any facial expressions. We don't know if, although it seems like they're not talking to each other, we can't actually make that out. Maybe they were talking on the way back and forth between the car and the house, but not actually at the car because outside was noisy. I think it's a very interesting element here, for sure. I wouldn't even say that it was very methodical or robotic. If you think about the last time you had to pack for a trip when you're going on holiday, you just want to get the job done. You're just kind of in that mood, okay, I've got 20 bags inside. They all need to go into the car. I'm just going to get it done. They don't have to be happy and cheery and singing and dancing during that time. The other thing to bring up is that everybody describes this surveillance footage as trance-like. And the reason why we all see it that way is because the main source, that being law enforcement, actually described their behavior as trance-like. They're an authoritative figure. We are much more likely to hear a fact or an opinion from them and believe it's fact. What I will say, though, is we definitely can't rule out the possibility that they were potentially on drugs. Maybe something was going on there. And I know a lot of people, many people see this differently than I do. And so I think, Charlie, I'd love to give you the floor here because I know that you see this in a very different way. And I find that great. I'm really interested to hear more about what you think was going on in this footage.
Okay, so I absolutely agree. It depends on what lens you're looking at the situation through. So I've thought about it through each individual lens, and I think it makes sense as you look through the different lenses. So you could say that how they are moving back and forth might show that they were on some type of drugs. And when I look at it through that lens, I can see it. Also, moving is a daunting task, and you just want to get it done. And I think everybody's moved before, so no, you really don't speak. You're just passing. And so that lens makes sense. The lens that may not make sense to a whole lot of people is if they were dabbling in the dark arts, if there was some type of satanic Bible that people were reading and there was paranormal activity and there were 4 ghosts in the house, and all of that, and you look at it through that lens, it gets a lot spookier and darker. And maybe that's why they were in a trance-like state. So I think it depends on the lens you view it from, and that is probably the less popular opinion, but I do believe in spirits and ghosts, and if you do and dabble in dark things, sometimes dark things happen, and that is a possibility. In my mind, that's also a theory and a possibility.
And that's the great thing about human psychology, right? There are so many different ways that we can all interpret this footage. And especially in an instance where the case remains unsolved, we don't actually know what they were doing or what they were thinking. All of these theories are as legitimate as each other. And yeah, I think that's It's a beautiful thing to be able to interpret things differently. But in this instance, yeah, it really doesn't help us get a clear answer as to what the Jamisons were thinking and feeling and doing at the time. I think you're muted, Charlie.
You are muted.
We love that. Me in every Zoom meeting. It is clear to me though that they were absolutely terrified. You don't go asking your pastor, your preacher for special bullets if you're not terrified. Like to even speak that, because most people, if you tell them, hey, I think there's 4 ghosts in my house, I think a good majority of people are going to be like, you're absolutely crazy. And then if you go and you ask for spirit bullets, they're going to be like, oh yeah, you're off your rocker. You must be on something, So at the very least, it's clear to me they were terrified and they wanted the heck out of there. So maybe that could be why they were just back and forth. They wanted out.
I was actually going to mention that because there are also theories about like some sort of shared psychotic break that possibly the both of them had. And that might have explained the odd movements of them going back and forth the way that we saw on the video. Although it is quite choppy, like we've talked about. But that's also a possibility.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that as well, Charlie. I think we're all talking about the different potential theories about what they were thinking and feeling in relation to the surveillance footage. But yes, you're right. They were absolutely terrified at the time. And for so many reasons, there were so many individual things going on in their lives at the time. Issues with family, with friends. We'll go into this more later on. But I agree 100%. They were scared and they were trying to get out fast.
And we do all know that Sherilynn had bipolar disorder and had struggled with depression. Apparently, she had even attempted suicide once. Do you think that her mental health could explain what happened, at least part of it?
Yeah, I think we touched on this already, but mental health absolutely played a role in the family's dynamics. I don't think it explains the entire disappearance for all of what it's worth. I do think that it played a role into it, though. Certainly up until the point that they had driven up this mountain, her mental health, as well as the mental health and just way of living and thinking for the rest of the family would have affected their decisions up until that point in time. They were looking to move off of their home and into a remote plot of land. Was that idea perhaps pushed more by Bobby, or was it by Sherilynn? And if it was by Sherilynn, why? Was she very unhappy with her life at the time? Was this a potential manic episode where, she had this idea in her mind, she just wanted to execute it, to live off of the land? But yeah, in terms of if I believe she is responsible for their deaths, I very highly doubt it. She loved her child. She loved Madyson a lot. She loved her husband, Bobby. There were issues in the family. I know from the reports that I read that she'd even left a long, I think it was 12 or 13-page letter of all of the things that she despised about him and the arguments they'd had in the past. So there was a lot of contention there. I don't think it was enough for her to feel like she wanted to annihilate her entire family, including herself. Yeah, and also the evidence that was left behind is very ambiguous, right? Usually you find a weapon, notes, like for example, a suicide note that I'm referring to there, but none of this was left behind. I think her struggles might have made the family more vulnerable to bad decisions or dangerous people, but I don't think it was the sole cause.
So what about the theory with the cult and that Sherilynn's name was on some type of hit list? Do you buy into that at all, or do you think that holds any weight?
Honestly, cult theories do often pop up in unsolved cases, and they're very hard to prove or disprove. We do have circumstantial details here. We know that the ex-tenant did have ties to a white supremacy group. Sherilynn did have interest in seances. She even left graffiti behind about witches. But I haven't seen any hard evidence to suggest that the Jamisons were part of a cult or, I was about to say had bad blood with the cult, but we still actually we do know that they did. Sherilyn's mother claims that her daughter was on a hit list. So yeah, we definitely can't rule out this possibility. What I will say as well is in the area that they were found, cults do exist. There are more cults in that area than there are for most of America. So if this was to happen, in an area like Oklahoma, yeah, it's definitely a possibility.
I was wondering about that because a lot more remote places like that have higher increase of cult activity. So I was wondering if that was the case. And to touch on the missing evidence, the briefcase that we see on the video and Sherilynn's handgun were never found. Do you think that they're key pieces of the puzzle?
Absolutely. I think on the topic of Sherilyn's gun, let's dive into that a little bit more. The gun was never found. It's not like the gun was left at home, the gun was found in the car. It was never found. And so it was absolutely misplaced by someone. So, yeah, where could it have gone? Because again, not in the home, not in the car, suggests that she had taken it with her on the day that her family disappeared, but was not found on her body, was not found in the area around their bodies, still is missing to this very day. What would that suggest to you guys? Because to me, it sounds like maybe she had it for self-defense. They encountered someone and it was taken away from her. A lot of people are kind of caught up in, okay, her gun is missing. Maybe she did murder her family. But if that was the case, when she would have then taken her own life, it would have been found next to her body. And to this day, it's still missing. So what are your thoughts?
No, I absolutely agree. I think that her gun was the murder weapon, and that's why it's not there. I think somebody got them off the road, got them out of the vehicle, maybe even somebody they know, and somehow turned that gun on them, and that's why we don't have the gun, and that explains the
I
hole
was
in the
about to
back of the
say,
skull.
yes, because it's possible that it was a bullet hole, even though their bodies were so far decomposed that we don't know for sure what it was. But it's still a
Mhm.
very suspicious piece to know that there was a hole in the back of Bobby's skull and that there's a missing handgun. It feels like two things that are clearly adding up to something. But of course,
Mhm.
that's just circumstantial.
So the ex-tenant that was part of or could still be, I don't know, part of a white supremacist group, do you think that there's a lead there, or it was just purely coincidence that this person happened to be a part of this group and these very odd, suspicious things are happening? Or do you think that was like an actual lead? Do we know if that person was cleared?
It's a good question. I don't know if the person was cleared or not. For me, I do think it's a coincidence that is simply too hard to ignore. I think that life is messy and you could look back at any person's history and make invalid connections between their disappearance and how they died versus who could have potentially been responsible. Just because this person was linked to a white supremacist group and they had an argument doesn't necessarily mean that this person would want them dead afterwards, especially if there is no real motive or gain outside of revenge through a petty argument. Yeah, coincidence. I'm more leading. I'd like to believe that this was just a coincidence. We don't know though, right? So I think that's just another aspect that muddies the water in this case. What I will add to that is that cults and extremist groups do often keep enemies lists, and if Sherilynn crossed paths with them and had a particularly volatile argument with them, then yeah, that could potentially lead to danger for the family. It also suggests another possible reason as to why the family was so scared and why they wanted to leave their former lives behind. Yeah, the lack of evidence doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means that it couldn't be proven or disproven.
Now, their remains were found less than 3 miles from the truck. In terms of walking on foot, that's actually a pretty decent distance. But in terms of searching the area, that's not very far at all. Do you think that investigators dropped the ball with this?
I really don't think that they did in this case. There are multiple things that could have affected their investigation and the way that they conducted their searches on the land. You know, this is a very dense woodland area. There is a lot of wilderness going on here, and it's out in the middle of nowhere. It's hard to gain access to the various woodlands around the location that they were discovered. And so I think it's very easy, especially in these circumstances and conditions, to walk literally 5 meters away from three bodies and not realize. For example, there was a case that I'd recently covered about a man who was trying to hide from law enforcement. And so he built this bunker underground and lived out in the middle of this woodland near a dumpster ground area where he could then salvage food and items from the dumpster. And he remained hidden and wasn't found for almost 4 years. And that's despite his bunker having a door, solar panels on top of the bunker. You know, there were signs of life there. And he was next to a very popular walking trail, the Ice Age Trail. Still, nobody found him for all of that time, which is, you know, a lot of people would think, wow, like, you know, what are the odds? But this is the truth. You know, the wilderness really does hide you. And I think you could be 10 feet away from a body and not realize it. So do I think the police dropped the ball? No. And this is under the assumption that the bodies were always there. Again, that wouldn't be at the fault of law enforcement if there were no bodies to find to begin with. One thing that I remember talking to you about, Charlie, a while ago was that I believe the conditions at the time they were discovered, it wasn't a cold night or day at all, was it? So they probably wouldn't have died through exposure to the elements.
They weren't like necessarily, I don't think, in like super warm clothing. So, I mean, that is a possibility that, you know, if it can occur between 30 and 50 and it got down to 40 at night, you know, you'd have to huddle probably pretty tight, but
And they could have done that.
yeah,
And
go
I
ahead.
also want to
Yeah.
mention the fact that their bodies were found 4 years after the fact. And that means that even if their bodies were there, it's possible that the elements might have revealed the bodies. Maybe they weren't, you know, buried deep enough. Maybe they were buried and they just happened to miss wherever they were placed by their potential murderers. And then their bodies were exposed by the elements over time. That's also a possibility. I think it's more likely that they were placed there after the fact, just because of how their bodies were positioned. But both of them have, credence to the theories.
That's right. And if we look at the way that law enforcement typically conducts a search operation, they'll usually start at the source of the last known location and provide an intense level of scrutiny and vigilance to the area. That they'll be going over absolutely everything to see if they can find even the smallest trace of evidence on the floor, maybe a leftover hairpin or, you know, even a strand of hair maybe on the truck or fingerprints, for example. But as you fan out from the search zone, obviously the amount of area that you have to cover is a lot more. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that the bodies were found 3 miles away from where the truck was located. And so when you get to that sort of area to cover, of course, your scrutiny and vigilance per square meter is going to be a lot less than from where you originally started. At that stage, you're probably looking at search parties, either within law enforcement or even volunteers. It could have just been one person that was responsible for the area that the bodies were found. And if that person were to walk 20 meters to the right, maybe on a decline, and maybe while leaves were covering the bodies, then they would have been none the wiser. But from law enforcement's point of view, they would have ticked off that area as this has been investigated. I think we have to keep that in mind because a 3-mile radius is already starting to push the limits of how scrutinous you can be.
Okay, so I know we've touched on this a little bit already, but the Jamisons reportedly believe that their house was haunted. We've talked about that. Spirits were tormenting them. Bobby even asked the pastor for special bullets to fight the ghost. What do you make of that? I know I've said what I make of it, but what do you make of that?
Yeah, it sounds bizarre, right? I think it shows the state of mind the Jamisons were in. Whether or not they actually believed in ghosts, they were clearly grappling with fear, paranoia, and maybe even delusions, depending on if you take that paranormally or drug induced. And yeah, some people interpret that as maybe they were on drugs, but it could also be untreated mental health issues amplified by stress, or even, yeah, I don't think I believe it is I don't believe in ghosts personally. That's not to discredit them, but do I think ghosts were literally involved in this case? It's hard to tell. I think although I don't believe in ghosts, they clearly had some beliefs in it, which would very clearly lean on the stress and fear that they may have been experiencing at the time. So yeah, it's a very interesting point, and this one does kind of veer away from the tangible evidence we can look at. It kind of more taps into the psychology of Sherilynn and Bobby.
So, Adrian, bottom line. After researching this case deeply, after all of this discussion, refreshing it, what is your personal theory?
You're not going to like my answer, but I still remain quite undecided, I think. The Jamisons were a very vulnerable family, especially at the time that they disappeared. We know that they were dealing with mental health issues, paranoia, stress, and there certainly were various potential threats from the outside. They had issues with their family, with friends, with their community, with previous tenants. From what I was reading, they even had issues with the school that Madyson was attending. I don't think that they were long-time hardened drug dealers, but I do believe that they certainly could have been potentially dabbling in that industry at the time. So, with all of these various factors and all of these, I'd say, unsettling issues that cause instability in their lives, there are so many various things which could have happened here, which, of course, is why we're discussing the many theories today. I do believe that their deaths were likely caused by an external party. I don't think this was a case of accident or, like self-inflicted family annihilation. I do believe that they were murdered by an external party. So yeah, I'm leaning towards homicide and foul play. But of course, without a cause of death, it's hard to say with certainty. I don't think my answer provides any clear outcome or conclusion to the case, unfortunately. Yeah, I think that's probably where I'd end it.
And only on 5 tonight, an Oklahoma mother may finally get the peace she has been waiting for.
Her son has been missing for 4 years now, but this weekend, a possible break. Sky 5 flew over the Sans Bois Mountains where hunters found the skeletal remains of 2 adults and a child. This is the same area where Bobby and Sherilynn Jamison disappeared with their young daughter. KOCO's Kim Passoff spoke to Bobby's mother about her long wait for answers.
All right. Well, Adrian, thank you for walking through this case with us. It's one of those mysteries where the more you look, the stranger it gets.
Absolutely. And of course, that's why people keep coming back to this story, because nothing seems to fit perfectly, right? And every theory has its gaps, but also has its own set of circumstantial evidence to support it. Either way, this story is extremely tragic. And we have to remember here that although we're discussing and speculating what could have possibly happened to these 3 in their final hours, they are a family. Whatever was going on in Sherilynn's and Bobby's lives before their point of death, they certainly didn't deserve to die. And then we're talking about Madyson, a 6-year-old girl that hadn't even started her life. And that's been robbed from her, either through tragedy or accident or homicide, we don't know. At the center of this entire story is a family that no longer is here to enjoy the lives that they deserved. I do just want to end this discussion on remembering who Sherilynn and Bobby and Madyson were too.
Yeah, and the story of all three of them, Bobby, Sherilynn, Madyson, it really hits hard because it shows how entire families can somehow vanish under the strangest of circumstances. And then even when they are found, the truth can still remain out of reach.
Yeah, and for everyone listening and watching, cases like this don't stay alive without people talking about them. That's why we do what we do here at Crime Solvers Central.
So if you know anything about the disappearance and deaths of the Jamison family, no matter how small, reach out to the Latimer County Sheriff's Office or the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. Tips can be the missing link in cases like these.
And if you don't have information but still would like to help, then the best thing you can do is share this story. Talk about it, post about it, keep their names alive. I think that is probably the best we can do as, for example, for me as an international person who's far away from America. Everyone watching outside of America, reposting this story really does help.
I completely agree. And Adrian, before we do wrap up, for anybody who wants to check out more of your work, where can they find you?
You can find me over on Coffeehouse Crime on YouTube, which is typically where I dive into true crime cases, with a few strange and dark stories mixed between them, at the same mix of detail and storytelling that we've done here today. And for all of my watchers out there, I just want to say it here first on this podcast that you can soon find me on Spotify too.
That's awesome. Definitely check him out, everyone. His video on the Jamison family is excellent, and he covers so many other cases that deserve attention.
That's going to do it for today's episode. If you enjoyed this discussion, hit that like button, subscribe to Crime Solver Central, and share this with anybody who loves true crime mysteries.
And remember, if you have tips, theories, or want to weigh in, leave a comment below or head over to our website, crimesolverscentral.com.
And thank you so much for having me on your show today, Charlie, Jayce, and the rest of your team. Honestly, I really do appreciate and support the work that you're doing at Crime Solver Central. I think it's great to have this sort of entity and forum and discussion going on. So yeah, I just wanted to say that I really appreciate you guys.
No, thank you so much for joining us, Adrian, and thank you to all of you for joining us as well.
Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and stay loud.